What's going on, Wellness Gang? Welcome back to Embodied Wellness Radio, a podcast framed around making women healthy again. And I'm super stoked about today's episode for a couple reasons. Number one, it is the final 2 episodes in the Adrenal Health series. I know that I said it was going to be a 6-part podcast, but in true Sarah fashion, I really felt like there was a little bit more that we could squeeze into this educational series. And so the case study portion, which we're doing, is actually going to be 2 parts. So on today's episode, we'll be going over 2 different case studies that look at high cortisol. One is actually in a postmenopausal female, and one is in a female that has a hormonal cascade of issues going on. So we can kind of connect the dots on some more complex cases. And if you listen back to the episode where I talked all about how cortisol and your adrenals can impact other hormone systems, we're going to really be able to look at how that looks in a very specific client case study and how that plays out. Another reason why I'm stoked about today's episode is we are actually recording this as a video. So it's going to be uploaded to YouTube. There's going to be many parts of this video where I'm mentioning some things on screen. And I actually do have the test that we ran for this specific client up on screen so you can see how that looks. And I will be referring to it quite often. So if you want to head over to our YouTube and take a look at the video, feel free to do so. Of course, I have redacted all of the client information, so there is no personal info on the screen, but it is a very valuable resource to be able to see A, what a hormone test looks like, and B, just to reference some of the things that I am discussing. So without further ado, let's get into it. Again, today we're going to be covering 2 different case studies. So in the first case study, we have a client who is a 41-year-old female, and she was dealing with resistant weight loss alongside of some menstrual irregularities. So in the past couple cycles, she had had very heavy bleeding, which was lasting for days at a time. And she had also been experiencing some other hormonal symptoms. She was getting acne as an adult, and we were also seeing some changes to other systems, such as blood sugar dysregulations, and overall the way that she was feeling, her sex drive, and her overall hormone status. So when we took a look at her Dutch test, and if you're unfamiliar with what a Dutch test is, it's a dried urine test that looks at hormones and hormone metabolites. So when you're running a Dutch test, you have a few different options of Dutch tests. But for this specific one, there is 4 samples taken throughout the day. So again, if you listen back to the episode on hormone testing, you'll know that that looks at cortisol throughout the day and what it's doing. It also shows sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone. It shows DHEA, which is another adrenal hormone. And it also shows some metabolic pathways, as well as other markers such as organic acids. So if you're watching this on video, we're going to go through some of what's shown up on the test. Otherwise, you can just listen along and we'll talk through this case study. So on the first page of a Dutch test, they have a hormone testing summary, which means that they're essentially looking at just an overview of what the next pages are going to get into. So here we can see that her cortisol is quite high. We have a normal waking cortisol. Her morning cortisol is pretty close to the high end of the range. We have definitely high cortisol in the afternoon, and in the evening is still within the normal range. But if you look over here to the side of the graph, we see that her total cortisol throughout the day, so again, that's a sum of all of the cortisol points, we see that it is high. However, her metabolized cortisol is in the normal range. Now, this is important to consider because we can have high cortisol period with normal cortisol metabolites. And because the cortisol is higher than the metabolites are, this is showing some issues with cortisol clearance. Now, if we go back to the fact that this client specifically has resistant weight loss and has gained some weight, we can also take this a step further to say that this client, and we'll see this in other areas, does have sluggish detox and just an overall more sluggish metabolism. So again, her ability to be able to clear this excess cortisol is not keeping up to the demand of the amount of cortisol that her body is putting out. So not only is she producing too much cortisol, but she's also not clearing it at an efficient rate for her body to maintain homeostasis. Now, here we also see that she does have high DHEA. And if you remember, DHEA is also an adrenal hormone. So we are seeing here overactive adrenals in general. So again, high DHEA as well as high cortisol. So we're just seeing this high adrenal output. Now, one thing that I always consider when I'm looking at any test is asking the question of, whose test is this? If I just see a test come in with high cortisol and high DHEA, to me, really, that doesn't mean much until I understand more about this person and why we're seeing these markers on the test. And this is unfortunately something that conventional medicine doesn't do that well, is they're really quick to look at, markers on a lab and say, this is high, this is low, and try to give a one-size-fits-all pill to the person to just treat that lab marker. But where that fails the individual is that it's not treating the person. It's just treating a piece of paper. So when we see something like high adrenal output, high cortisol, high DHEA, we always need to investigate factors as to why. So being a functional practitioner and being, trained and well-versed in hormones and reading specific tests like this, I'm able to start to go through, okay, why might this be the case? So we have issues that could cause this, such as high stress, of course, and going back to the podcast episodes, we know that stress can fall under lots of different categories. One of those being blood sugar dysregulations. So for this specific client, we actually did have blood work done as well, which showed that she did have issues with blood sugar dysregulation. And if you're unsure how that looks on blood work, typically they would look at markers such as fasting glucose, fasting insulin, and hemoglobin A1C. So we can see if these are dysregulated. That could be one thing that is driving the stress response or the overactive adrenals in this case. Inflammation is another one. So that's kind of a very general term. And there are different ways to look at, inflammatory pathways and where that's coming from. But a fairly general marker that you can run on a blood draw is something called CRP, or C-reactive protein. So this is going to give us some insight into inflammation in the body. It's nonspecific, meaning it doesn't tell us where the inflammation is coming from. But again, for a client where we would see elevations of CRP on blood work, plus high cortisol, plus high DHEA, we know that this is being influenced partially by inflammation as well. Then we also have things like excess alcohol intake, which again can also drive inflammation, can also drive blood sugar issues, and a few other lifestyle factors here. It could be lack of sleep. And then again, going back, just anything that falls under the category of stress can cause this high adrenal output. Now, when we want to look at this specific client or this case and looking at addressing again one of her chief concerns, which was resistant weight loss, we also want to take a look at the impact that these high levels of DHEA and cortisol are having on other sex hormones. Because we know, yes, cortisol is really important for weight loss and weight management. And there's something called like the cortisol belly, where many people who have high cortisol will store a lot of belly fat and have issues with that. DHEA is also inherently an anabolic hormone. And so many women who do have high DHEA, which we see a lot of the times in PCOS clients and high androgens, can have issues with weight loss and weight management. So the nice thing about running something like a Dutch test is we were able to see how this is impacting other hormones. So when we go to this next page here on the left, they just have a breakdown of specific numbers and markers in a written form and a list. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, or on the third page of the Dutch test, we do see this in more of a chart form where it's also showing pathways and conversions, which for this specific client is really nice to look at. So we'll see here that we have androgens over on the left. So again, these are hormones that are considered androgens. We would typically think of these as like quote unquote male hormones, although they are very important for females as well. So we have DHEA, testosterone, and then metabolites, so such as androstenedione. And it also shows on the Dutch test, because we are again testing metabolites and metabolic pathways, whether clients have a 5A or a 5B preference. If you're like, what the heck is that? It essentially just means once we make testosterone, are we converting it into a more potent form or a less potent form? And what does our body prefer? Again, this is important to look at because you could have normal levels of testosterone, but clients might still have a lot of symptoms of excess testosterone. And we're like, okay, what the heck's going on here? However, if they have a 5A preference that is more androgenic and they are going to experience more of those high testosterone symptoms, even though their testosterone is quote unquote normal. So again, for this client, we'll see here that she has high DHEA, which again, going back is an adrenal hormone. This can come from elevated stress. This can come from inflammation. This can come from blood sugar dysregulations, excess alcohol intake. But her testosterone is quite low. Now, without getting too much into hormonal cascades, DHEA can convert into testosterone. So when we have really high DHEA and low testosterone, we have to ask ourselves, where the heck is it going? So one place that it can go is testosterone can be converted into the hormone estrogen through something called the aromatase pathway or upregulated aromatase. A lot of sciencey words, you don't need to know that. We just need to know that your testosterone, which can come from DHEA, can be converted into estrogen. Now, why does this take place? A lot of the things that we mentioned. So we could have blood sugar dysregulations. A really big one is alcohol can upregulate the aromatase pathway. Again, inflammation. And then we also see this with people who have excess adipose tissue, so excess fatty tissue. So now we have kind of like a chicken and an egg effect where it's like, okay, we have resistant weight loss, and then we have a lot of our testosterone, which we need for good metabolic health, being converted into estrogen. And estrogen, like we talked about, can also raise cortisol. And when we have more estrogen, we tend to store more body fat. So we really have this hormonal shitstorm taking place. And when we look at this client's Dutch test, we can see here, yes, she does have elevations of estrogen. So that might not mean that her body is necessarily producing way too much estrogen. It could be that a lot of her testosterone is converting into estrogen. So again, this could come from the high adrenal output of DHEA, which is going to testosterone, and then her body is converting a lot of that to estrogen. So now we have low testosterone, which is again going to cause issues with her resistant weight loss, high DHEA, which is also going to contribute to that, and high estrogen, which is all going to contribute to that. And when we take a broader spectrum, as I mentioned, we're not just looking at estrogen alone and being like, this client needs to take a bunch of DIM or estrogen detox supplements. We're also looking at, okay, why is so much of your testosterone going to estrogen, and how can we down-regulate that pathway so that you're able to keep your testosterone, which is really important, and also balance estrogen levels. So this is again why doing client intake forms and reading in context to the person is really important. So with this 41-year-old client who does enjoy drinking alcohol, that's one lifestyle change that's going to be really important to make. I wouldn't ask this client to start taking a bunch of supplements without addressing some of these other lifestyle things that are really going to impact this. Again, then we also need to look at blood sugar. So with dysregulations to blood sugar, we're going to start to look at, nutrient timing. We're going to start to look at macro balance at meals. We're going to start to look at total nutrients that she's taking in. We're going to start to look at things like mineral status that really help with blood sugar balance. Using things like, cinnamon, chromium are really helpful for that, as well as adequate potassium, and really making sure that we are focusing on that blood sugar stability through nutrition and through some additions to that, and stress management and sleep and all the other things that impact blood sugar, so that we're able to keep blood sugar stable, which will also help with keeping inflammation lower, which then again will help with lowering DHEA, lowering cortisol, and helping with some of this excess aromatase activity, as well as estrogen balance. Now you're probably like, holy crap, that's a lot. But again, the main overarching idea here is that when we are looking at things like high cortisol, high DHEA, and we start to look at some more of these specifics, we can understand more about the person and see, okay, this is potentially why this specific client's test looks like this. And we can work on everything that I mentioned in the last episode, the lifestyle factors, the sleep and the rest, proper nutrition, proper supplementation in a very specific way to this client, instead of just being like generally, okay, make sure you're eating enough protein and eat a crap ton of cruciferous vegetables to detox your estrogen, or, take a cortisol lowering supplement, without actually addressing all of this other stuff. We would be doing this client a huge disservice. Okay. So now we are going to go to the next page. We can see here that this client's progesterone is actually in a really great place. So that's good. A lot of the times, or many times, that we see high cortisol, as I talked about in a previous episode, that can impact progesterone production. But for this specific client, she does have good levels of progesterone still. Okay, so when we go to this next page, this is looking more at the adrenal piece. So we'll see here that we have melatonin at the top, which, if we remember, when cortisol is high, melatonin is low, and vice versa. We can't be making enough melatonin if we have high cortisol, especially in the later half of the day. It's also just showing us in this picture that your adrenals do produce both DHEA and cortisol. And if you listen to the previous episodes, you'll know that we do need those two in a good balance. And it also is showing here whether this client has a preference for more cortisone or cortisol metabolites. So we're not going to get too much into that, as we haven't really discussed it. But again, the main thing here to look at is that her totals here are high when we add up the sum of both cortisol and cortisone, and DHEA is also high. So we have high adrenal output firing on all fronts. And we can also see here that her melatonin is still actually in a pretty decent place, which is good. This is waking melatonin, so we aren't necessarily seeing the melatonin in the evening, but her waking melatonin is pushing towards the higher end of the range as well. So here again, when we are looking at the adrenal hormones, it's interesting that if we even think about the way the Dutch test is structured, it does come after the sex hormones, looking at this more specifically. So we are again considering all of the other things that we just discussed when interpreting this specific client's form, to see that cortisol and DHEA are both high. So that's talking a little bit through like the hormones in this case study. I'm not going to go super in depth because I know it can be a lot of information, and also I want to keep the information pertinent to the discussion of adrenal health. But the main things to know from this case study were that we do have high cortisol and high DHEA, so high adrenal output across the board. And then we are also seeing that this client probably is being driven by things like inflammation, alcohol intake, dysregulated blood sugar, and some lifestyle factors. So in a treatment plan for this client, we would include some supplements. So there are some supplements that are good at helping to regulate and balance DHEA. In the beginning, it's also helpful to take supplements that are going to help to regulate cortisol and bring it down, especially at points of the day that it's high. So like Cortisol Manager is a really good one. You can also use adaptogenic herbs, as well as addressing things like inflammation and blood sugar. So in the beginning with blood sugar dysregulations, as we work on nutrition, so all the things that I mentioned, there are some supplemental supports that can also help with blood sugar balance as well. And then being mindful of alcohol intake too. Now, going back to where I talked about her cortisol clearance being a little bit sluggish, and also seeing that her estrogen is high, we do also want to focus on the side of things where we are looking at her detox pathways and abilities. Because when we have a bunch of excess hormones, cortisol, DHEA, estrogen, if you have too much hormones and your body isn't properly able to metabolize and excrete them, there are going to be issues coming up with not only the excess hormones, period, but also for kind of doubling that or really magnifying that, because your body also isn't able to clear them properly. Now, when we do have somebody who maybe drinks, and I'm not saying even being an alcoholic, right? Drinking, well, I always have to bite my tongue, but don't shoot the messenger. So this recent studies show that having zero alcohol is best for females, especially when we have high estrogen as an issue. Alcohol directly impairs estrogen detoxification and impacts blood sugar for a couple days after drinking. So I'm not even talking like excess alcohol intake as in somebody who's crushing a bottle of wine every night. We're talking like 1 or 2 glasses every couple nights can really throw things off. So we also want to understand the impact that can have on liver health. So in addition to all the other supports and working on specific supplements in the beginning and the lifestyle piece, we really want to work on opening detox pathways and enhancing it. So this could be things like using a liver support supplement. I'm really big on castor oil packs a few times a week. Also, we want to look at doing things like sauna or Epsom salt baths and making sure that we are making low tox swaps where we can for things like beauty products. And moving lymph, exercise is really important as well, making sure that we're moving our body and really doing all of the other supplemental supports we can to not only just directly target these hormones, but to make sure that we're properly able to clear and metabolize and get rid of them. So with a client like this, we would go on hormone support using the supplements again and all of the lifestyle things for around 3 months as the minimum amount of time we want to stay on anything targeting hormones to really see an effect. And then after that, start to look at where her symptoms are at and how we can change things. So let's say we started on that for 3 months and now periods are back to having regular flow. And we are starting to see a little bit of weight loss come off. So if we were taking a supplement for estrogen detox, specifically like DIM, we would say, okay, now let's try taking DIM out. We're still going to be focusing on liver health. We're still going to keep the lifestyle practices in check. We're still going to focus on all of those things like sleep, blood sugar, inflammation, stress management. But we're going to start to see if we can peel back some of the supplements and just continue to focus on the lifestyle stuff. You probably hear me talk about this all the time, but I say supplements should not be forever. They are part of a corrective phase to bring your body back to balance, but the goal should be to create the lifestyle habits that help you to stay better. And again, especially when we're looking at adrenal health, her cortisol is not going to stay in a good range if she doesn't focus on the lifestyle piece. If she just wants to stay on cortisol manager for the rest of her life and not address any of the lifestyle stuff, it is going to be like trying to build a house on quicksand and not work very well. So the lifestyle stuff is really, really what helps you to get better and stay better. And the supplements really are short term. So her integrated strategy looked like supplements, looking at inflammation through things like nutrition, alcohol, making sure that we're sleeping, moving our body, supporting detox pathways, and including nervous system support, especially at the times of days where cortisol is high and elevated. Now, the other thing that I didn't really mention here, that when we see elevations of cortisol that I always double check with clients is if they had caffeine around this time. So doing a Dutch test, you should not be consuming any caffeine, but I always like to check as if somebody was to, let's say, have a cup of coffee and then take their afternoon cortisol, we could have a false elevation. So we always want to keep note of things like that and also make sure that we are just keeping in mind that caffeine can be an added stressor, especially when somebody does have high cortisol. So there we have case example number 1, which is a little bit more complex because we have lots going on with all these different hormone puzzle pieces. And we are going to get into the second one, which arguably is a little bit more simple. So this client has gone through surgical menopause, meaning that she had a double hysterectomy and as such stopped getting her period altogether. Now, this client and I had actually been working together for quite some time before running this test. And her main goal when we started together was to lose all of the weight that she gained from the double hysterectomy. And this client had been a high-performing elite athlete her whole life, had gone through the surgical menopause and put on somewhere between like 30 to 50 pounds. She doesn't weigh herself and was really just feeling not herself and having a mental impact from the weight gain. So we worked together. We started with nutrition and a training program, and she was able to lose all of the weight and more. She looks absolutely incredible. She is 52. Now I think she's 54 years young, but at the time she was 52 years young. She seriously that is goals for when I'm her age. You've probably seen her on my page before. You can go look. I've posted her transformation there, and she is a delight of a client to work with. I love her so much. So we had been working together for some time, and she was still experiencing some symptoms which are really common for those who've been through any kind of menopause, surgical or natural, such as insomnia, as well as having hot flashes. So at the point that we ran this test, she had lost all the weight that she wanted to. She had really great lifestyle habits. She's eating well. She was moving her body. She was doing the best that she can to do things like manage stress. She lives a pretty happy life. But she is also a very high level boss babe, and she runs companies that have made multi-million dollars. So her job inherently is pretty stressful. So that's one thing to consider. So again, her chief complaints at the time of, or chief symptoms at the time of running this test were insomnia and hot flashes. So when we ran this Dutch test, we can see here that a lot of her hormone levels like progesterone and estrogen are going to be low because she's no longer cycling. It's normal that you'll see here this little purple, if you're looking at the screen, this little purple range is the postmenopausal range. So that's where we would expect to see things. So estrogen will be low, progesterone will be low, but we can see here with her daily cortisol pattern that we do have high points both in the afternoon and evening, and the waking and the morning cortisol are still pushing towards the higher end of the range. Now, when we look over at the totals here, we do see that her total free cortisol is elevated and her metabolized cortisol is very low. We also see DHEA is relatively low here, which again, we always have to interpret in the reference range of the age of the individual and understand that. So for this one, the main thing that we are focusing on is looking at the cortisol. So I'll just briefly go through this second and third page here, although there's not as much to note. Again, we do see DHEA as relatively on the lower end of the range, even for her age range. So it looks a lot lower than it is, again, considering the fact that she was 52 at the time of the test. Testosterone does look good, especially when interpreting it, again, in relation to her age range. Metabolites look good. Progesterone and estrogen are in a good place for postmenopause. We do see a little bit lower estrogen than we would like. However, she did go through surgical menopause a lot earlier than what she might have naturally gone through. So that's also something to consider when we're looking at age ranges. But we did add some supports to work on bringing up estrogen and making sure that we were addressing that, as estrogen or low estrogen can lead to a lot of hot flashes and insomnia as well. So this specific client had actually tried HRT before. If you don't know what that is, hormone replacement therapy, and it didn't make her feel good. So she didn't want to go back on that. So we used some natural supports for estrogen, such as phytoestrogens, making sure we have good dietary fats, flaxseed, and really worked on that. So the main thing here that was driving her symptoms, in addition to, supporting estrogen, was the high cortisol. And especially because her cortisol was high in the afternoon and evening, this is going to impact melatonin production, and high cortisol can lead to insomnia. If you recall, high cortisol cortisol in general is important for our stress response, but it also makes us feel more alert and more awake and more aware. So from an evolutionary standpoint, cortisol will increase our energy and alertness in order to allow us to do things like run away from bears or immediate threats. And so when her cortisol is high in the afternoon and evening, this is going to lead to a lot of sleep issues. So again, the thing we want to check is, did we consume caffeine? Did we work out? All of the things that could lead to potentially false elevations on the test. And if that is a no, then we do want to work on managing cortisol in the evening. So yes, we want to work on using things like supplements that can lower cortisol in the evening, but also looking at, what is she doing in the evening? Are her evenings stressful? Is she maybe in the evening, staying on blue light, looking at screens, maybe working really late because she, as we know, is a high level executive in a company. So she probably is working later than our body would want to, or she quote unquote should from a biological standpoint. So we do want to address these different factors. And if we're looking at blue light, that's going to directly impact our melatonin production, which again can lead to insomnia. And it can also lead to higher cortisol if we're working in the evening. Maybe something happens in business or in work that is quite stressful. So these are all things that we want to consider. So here again, we did work on bringing up estrogen through things like nutrition and using some supplements and things like flaxseed to help to bring that up. That's going to help somewhat with the hot flashes and insomnia, but also looking at the piece of high cortisol in the afternoon and evening. So there again, we were looking at things like blue light exposure, looking at her evening routine, looking at screen time, and then using supplements as well, and really making sure that in the evening time, she does have a proper nervous system supporting wind down routine that signals to her body, hey, it is time to chill out and it is time to go to sleep. We can't just be working and shut our laptops and right away our brain turns off, especially for somebody who is type A and high functioning. A lot of those clients I've seen have a hard time turning off their brain. And so we really want to make sure that we're supporting our nervous system, especially in the evening. And in doing so, that helped immensely with her hot flashes and insomnia and helped her to actually be able to sleep through the night, which was quite amazing. So again, this just goes to show how cortisol can impact lots of different things from sleep to even hot flashes. And without getting too much into it, because I do think I will do a whole podcast series on perimenopause and menopause. When we go through perimenopause into menopause, there's parts of our brain that are also shifting. And our nervous system and our CNS gets quite affected by the changes that occur. And there's a part of our brain that regulates temperature that does shift going through perimenopause and into menopause. And so that thermoregulatory mechanism in our brain and in our body is not functioning at the same capacity as it is when we're younger. So that can also play a role in hot flashes. And again, that does get related to the nervous system and our brain and that communication. And especially when we go through surgical menopause, we don't have the time. Perimenopause is about 7 to 10 years to naturally transition. And a lot of the symptoms can be more extreme for women. So we also, again, want to go back to understanding the impact that our nervous system and even cortisol can have on things like thermoregulation, especially around the time of perimenopause and menopause. So this one was a relatively more simple case. Again, we had already done so much work together to have a really good foundation that it was just a couple tweaks that really helped her to mitigate her symptoms. Whereas in the first case example, we were just starting out and she had ran a Dutch test with a previous provider, and we were starting out to look at the Dutch test and start to work on some of the symptoms she was experiencing. So we did have quite a bit more work to do there in the lifestyle stuff, in the nutrition pieces, and there was a lot more variables in that one. So the point of this is to show you how high cortisol or just looking at adrenal dysregulation can show up in different ways in different people, and why it's really important to take an individualized look at things. And you'll also hear or know that, the ways that we supported these clients were different. So although on paper, both of them have high cortisol, the actual support and the program and the protocol that they got is immensely different because they have different symptoms going on. They are two very different people at different points of life. And again, goes to show why having an individualized approach and really doing an in-depth intake to understand the person, not just the piece of paper, is so key for proper healing programs. So thank you so much for tuning in. These were 2 high cortisol samples. On next week's podcast, we're going to go through 2 case studies. One is my own healing journey, and another case study that look at low cortisol in myself, and then cortisol dysregulation that would look more like an adaptive phase in another client. So I'm so excited to chat with you next week. I will see you then, Wellness Gang.